Around Christmas of 1532, the Inquisition of Cologne had halted the printing of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's masterpiece, the 3 books on occult philosophy, and through the first half of 1533, Agrippa and his ally, the Archbishop-Elector of Cologne, Hermann von Wied, yes, an archbishop, successfully fought the Inquisition and had the book printed in its completion in July of 1533. One of the greatest works of Western esotericism had survived the Inquisition, but the scars of that battle can still be seen in the minor variants of the first printing, marking before and after inquisitorial interference. But by the summer of 1533, Agrippa's correspondence, how we know what happened to him mostly in his life, it evaporated, along with our last sure knowledge of what happened to him in the last years of his life. According to our best source, his student Johann Weyer, Agrippa was briefly imprisoned and died in France in 1535. Just 2 years later, he was less than 50 years old, and with his death, and probably before it, Agrippa entered into as much legend as history. Quickly, Agrippa became associated with exactly the necromantic black magic he sought to reject and reform throughout his entire life. But the fact remains that his 3 books on occult philosophy remain much more a work of theory, more a book of literary analysis in some ways than one of practice. And magic has, of course, always been about practice, first and foremost. Thus, we should be totally unsurprised that in the decades following Agrippa's death, that a very much practical manual of magic would appear under his name and under his aegis. That manual would appear in 1559, nearly a quarter century after Agrippa's death, under the title The 4th Book on Occult Philosophy, or on Ceremonial Magic. What do we learn about the practice of magic, even necromancy, from this manual? And frankly, did Agrippa even compose this book at all? Let's explore the 4th book on occult philosophy. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my numerous other content on topics in esotericism. And if you want to support this work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at my Patreon, perhaps with a one-time donation via PayPal, or you can check out some of the cool black metal style merch we have on the channel. Again, all of that work helps to keep the lights on and keep me buying weird old books to present this information to you guys. But now, let's turn to the 4th book on occult philosophy, alleged to be the very secret key of magic composed by Agrippa himself. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. So this episode's doubly special. It's part of my ongoing seminar on the occult philosophy of Agrippa that will actually be wrapping up soon. So if you're watching this a bit later, make sure to check out the entire series. If you really want to dive deep into the seminal work of Western esotericism, check out my 14-part, I think it will be 14-part seminar on Agrippa and his occult philosophy. But also, I'm really happy to be working with my friends and colleagues here on ReligionTube to create a bit more of spooky content through this season. So check out their channels, of course, in the links below. Again, it's always kind of spooky season around here, so making an episode on a 16th century manual of magic that ends with how to raise the spirits of the dead, it's basically just a normal work week around here. But again, make sure to check out Angela's channel at Angela Symposium and Philip's channel over at Let's Talk Religion, and tell them I send my best and happy spooky season. As I mentioned in the introduction to the video, Agrippa's 3 books on occult philosophy are much more theoretical and programmatic, even literary in character, much more so than practical manuals of magic. Though I will say that the 1533 edition actually does contain much more in the way of operative magic than the original 1510 draft that he presented through Abbot Trithemius. But magic is nothing if not oriented around the practical, results-oriented, and about getting things done in the world. It's transitive and operative. And so we should be totally unsurprised by someone interested in magic studying the 3 books on occult philosophy, getting to the end of it and being like, well, what now? How do I do any of this, Agrippa? And aside from some of the sigil magic and some of the amulets added to the 1533 mature edition, there really isn't a lot to go on in the actual 3 books on occult philosophy. Occult philosophy, not the doing so much. But that's a feature, not a bug from Agrippa's point of view. For him, magic was a boon that one acquired in the process of gaining divine illumination and communion with God in joyful felicity, and not so much about attempting to use magic to get power, wealth, love, fame, or really any such material worldly benefits, especially through interacting with spirits, ghosts, and, well, demons and spirits of the dead. Agrippa wasn't about that. That kind of material is basically missing on purpose from the 3 books of occult philosophy, precisely because Agrippa rejected what he called modern magic. That is, the medieval grimoire-style necromantic magic, focusing specifically on spirit conjuration and binding for a larger reformation of magic along Hermetic and Kabbalistic lines. Hence, there isn't and wouldn't be that kind of information in the 3 books on occult philosophy, because Agrippa rejected that kind of magic for a more Ficino-style exaltative magic. In fact, in one of the letters attached to the end of the 3 books on occult philosophy, Agrippa himself condemns another German wizard, I guess, alleged to have such powers as either a charlatan or in league with demonic powers, or both. But while Agrippa's 3 books isn't directly a magical manual, it often hints in that direction with things like sigils, tables for generating the names of spirits, and it even lightly touches upon demonology, which is condemned as quickly as it is mentioned. Again, much more so than the original 1510 draft, and much more so than the magical reformers he seeks to follow like Ficino, Pico, and Reuchlin. Thus, the 3 books on occult philosophy does whet the palate for more magical practice, well, more than a little bit if we're going to be honest. Further, Agrippa does hint in both letters and in the extended 1533 epilogue that some secret key is required to unlock the deeper truth and power of the 3 books. In a letter of 24th September 1527, several years before the printing of the 1533 3 books, Agrippa says that this key would only be shared orally with his close friends, the guy he's writing this letter with. And further, the 1533 ends with Agrippa warning the reader that he's hidden the truth of the 3 books of occult philosophy in puzzles that will ensnare the wicked, a warning that actually does not appear in the original ending of the 1510. Of course, this kind of warning was pretty typical of most magical and alchemical manuals of the time. In fact, Agrippa's own warning is almost a literal quotation from the famed alchemist Geber, but Agrippa wasn't one to bluff, in my experience, or dissimulate more generally. I should suspect we should take his warnings at face value and take them quite seriously. Thus, we find the greatest magical treatise in Western esotericism arguably desperately in need of a practical, workable mode, a way to do it, so to speak. And also, Agrippa himself is promising in letters and in other places kind of warnings for a secret key that would unlock the power of the text. A text booby-trapped against the eyes of the crooked and the wicked as he has it, so it's completely unsurprising. It's honestly surprising, actually, that it took 24 years for a book to appear which claims to be just that key for practicing the ceremonial magic, the religious magic, only hinted at by Agrippa in the 3 books and some of his letters. That book, Liber Quartus de Occulta Philosophia su Ceremoniis Magicis, would first appear printed at Marburg in 1559. The text, written in the voice of Agrippa, admittedly, clearly announces in the very first lines that it is, in fact, the key and the practical expression of the 3 books of occult philosophy. And with that short introduction, that text it's off to the races. Like most operative magic dealing with spirits, it's essential to obtain the secret names of those spirits by which magic itself is accomplished, and Book 4, or the Quartus as I'm just going to call it, deals with how to do that right out of the gate using the very Kabbalistic tables found in the 27th chapter of the 3rd book of Agrippa's occult philosophy. So the text very much intersects with the Agrippan occult philosophy, no matter what the authorship question is. However, the Quartus is very astrologically precise in how to derive the magical names of the good and bad spirits, along with the all-important Anima Mundi, or the world spirit. Of course, those tables in Agrippa are actually in Hebrew letters, they're Kabbalistic tables, and vowels needed to be supplied in order to pronounce them in incantations, so a method is provided, though I have to admit that a good bit of those opening sections of the Quartus are, frankly, quite befuddling, to be honest. The Quartus also allows for the Hebrew letters to be translated into the Latin letters for ease of use in case you don't really understand Hebrew. In fact, this flexibility is one of the defining features of the Quartus as a book. It will often provide a rigorous, detailed, and frankly difficult magical procedure before just coming out and saying, oh, there's an easier way to do this. Do it this way, and it works just the same. That ceremonial flexibility is in rather stark contrast to many other magical manuals of the time with their extreme ritual strictures, and who doesn't need some ceremonial flexibility these days? As I mentioned, following several complex astrological derivations of good and bad spirit names, we come to the description of the celestial sigils in two rebus-like sets of characters which attend to the good and bad spirits, respectively. In fact, we learn that these characters, these rather strange little images, have been revealed by the spirits themselves and are in fact clues to the virtues or nature of those various spirits. We learn something about them by applying these rebus-like characters to the angels or to the spirits. Of course, in magical practice, the real and the symbolic are often very fundamentally compounded. There's very little light between those in many cases. What then follows, apparently born out of magical experience from the text, are detailed descriptions of the appearance of the planetary spirits. Saturn is, of course, associated with old age, dragons, owls, and the scythe and darkness. Venus, on the other hand, is a beautiful, young, sometimes naked woman, white, glazed with gold, and even a dove, flowers, or sometimes even a king riding on a camel, because that's Venusian. Such detailed descriptions of spiritual creatures would actually flourish during this period, with detailed demonological catalogs describing such beings in pretty specific detail, actually. Such catalogs would ultimately be, of course, be lambasted by people like Agrippa's student Johann Weyer in his Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, which itself became a precursor for the catalog of the Goetia in the infamous Lesser Key of Solomon. So already in this text we have a kind of precursor of the kind of demonological catalogs that we'll see explode on the scene in just a century. But what sets the Quartus apart here is its relative simplicity, and I think that's a virtue in many ways than the complex demonological catalogs that we otherwise see. Though, however, we are dealing with not only good but also evil spirits in the Quartus, even spirits of the malevolent dead, so we're going to need some magical protections, of course. Those will take the form of pentacles, which are geometric figures inlaid with binding sigils and powerful divine names, along with the images or names of the very spirits that you want to bind. One may even use sacred imagery or powerful quotations from scripture. Again, the Quartus is nothing if not flexible in its application. But with the appropriate pentacle made, seemingly these can be composed on the floor, on sand, on paper. The medium seems to make, again, very little difference for the Quartus. One can then begin to direct one's magical force, one's magical intention to harm an enemy, to gain divine favor, to fulfill a desire. The text doesn't specifically mention how to find buried treasure, but I'm just gonna say that it's implied. Or have a demon drive someone to destruction. Typical wizard stuff. Of course, you're going to need to bind some of those spirits to get them to do said treasure hunting and destroying of your enemies. And wouldn't you guess it, we get 3 different binding techniques. So again, pick your own. Also, it turns out that you can magically bind things like tempests, animals, and even fire through various natural orders, through the holy mysteries, and by divine names and sigils, or various forms of conjurations. Again, the Quartus is nothing if not the choose-your-own-adventure of magic. But of course, in order to perform those conjurations, you're going to want to first consecrate all of your magical tools, pentacles, and circles, lest those evil spirits that you intend on conjuring, tear your soul apart, Cenobite style, rather than leading you on a fun, goony adventure. We don't want to get our souls ripped apart, now do we? Consecrations should be performed by a faithful person with an unshakable faith, so good luck finding that one, armed with prayers, divine names, blessings, holy oil and water, consecrated candles, and or sacred fumigation via incense, all performed, of course, with the correct intentions, meditating all the while on the awesome works of God specific to the kind of operation that the magician wants to do. If you're going to be dealing specifically with evil spirits, i.e. the fun ones, you're going to need to create a Liber Spiritum, or a book of spirits that will be bound to those malevolent entities. This volume contains descriptions, depictions, and sigils of said evil spirits. It's a Goetia-style demonic catalog, as I mentioned, written upon virgin paper and consecrated according to the either one of two methods. Again, one quite difficult, but though in that case the demons do actually appear visibly, the other one a bit easier, but they don't appear. One requires remaining within a magic circle and binding each demon on each page one at a time, probably turning the pages with a sword so you don't cross out of the circle. The other has further invocations and binding spells at the end of the book with layman's as bookends when the weather is clear. Recall that demons live in the upper air, so you'll need calm weather, so no gothic, dark, and stormy nights here. You bury that volume eventually at a crossroads and retrieve it a few days later, along with the appropriate consecrations, magic circles, and incantations. You probably also want to wrap that book in like a trash bag or something so it doesn't get soiled. Once your Liber Spiritum is made, it will allow you to fast track summoning those spirits as they'll be bound via that very book. It's like having them on speed dial. Of course, you'll need to be careful with it because it is a literal book load of evil spirits, and you don't want to like leave that on the kitchen table for the kiddos to play with, because try explaining that mess to your partner or the police. The Quartus provides further instructions for summoning spirits. Again, all rather flexible considering what we're doing here. Summoning metaphysical, supernatural entities. And these involve rituals for purification, for fasting. One Kabbalistic ritual takes 40 days. Well, there's another one. It just takes a week. So why do the Kabbalistic one? So this whole section feels a bit like an abbreviated version of something like the Abramelin ritual, or perhaps something like the Liber Iuratus, and you can check out my videos on both of those magical books and magical systems. But here we have a fully formed Solomonic style ritual with linen robes, layman's headgear, and all the trappings of medieval ceremonial magic. Some rituals are complex, but again, the Quartus is always happy to provide you with a hack, with a shortcut version that seems to work just as well, frankly, though in those, typically, as I mentioned, the spirits don't appear visible to you, but don't worry, they're there, and definitely don't leave the magical circle. We also have instructions for receiving oracles and inspired dreams through magical practices, apparently even the ability to receive instant illumination on various topics, a la the Ars Notoria, which you can also check out my episode about as well. Some further directions are given for summoning and protecting oneself while summoning evil spirits, of course, because, you know, Cenobite stuff. The Quartus even imagines your friends joining in inside the magical circle while you do all this, so sorcery is also it's a team sport now. You can make friends summoning demons together. Of course, evil spirits might also be obstinate. They are evil after all, so you're going to need to compel them from time to time. But once they do show up, the Quartus reminds us that you need to be nice. Make sure to never leave the magic circle, as I noted, even if the spirits aren't visible. But if you do leave the circle, make sure to make a kind of magical tunnel protected with holy names. Oh yeah, you're also going to need a sword, because why not have a sword? Should never trust a sorcerer without a sword. Why? Demons hate swords, according to Michael Sellis, who kind of wrote the book on demons, because they're of an airy nature, demons are. They're sort of airy in nature, ethereal, and they can be easily cleaved with iron swords, but of course, being immortal, they come right back together, but they feel all the agony of being cut apart. Demons are, they're sensitive, so yes, you'll need a sword. The claymore, the better. Finally, at the end of the Quartus, we get some necromancy, because of course we do. Spirits of people who are especially gluttonous or licentious or die violently may linger about the world. They cling to physical pleasures, or they don't know that they're dead. And you can summon them too. How? Well, typical necromancy stuff. You burn an incense composed of blood and corpse parts, bones, milk, honey, oil, and so forth. Has a little bit of Odysseus vibes. to lure the spirits in places like burial grounds or execution sites, or just basically any place that's witness to enormous death and suffering. The exact techniques here are surprisingly vague, but a wide range of options are probably open for the would-be necromancy in the Quartus, though the text does warn us that despite everything, the summoning of the restless dead may not work for extra-natural reasons beyond human comprehension. Then, the text just kind of ends. It just comes to an abrupt conclusion. Despite the flexible and user-friendly approach to the magic found in the Quartus, the text indicates that maybe it's still too challenging, frankly, for newbie sorcerers, I suppose. So with that problem in mind, the text just then appends Pseudo Abano's Elements of Magic, also known as the Heptameron, as a kind of further magical training or further magical training wheels. Magical training wheels, probably because the text very carefully details the creation of things like magical circles, and in that case only involves the summoning of good spirits and angels, so no pesky demons or spirits of the evil dead to deal with, don't want to start off with those. It also is worth mentioning that this is the first time that the Elements of Magic, the Heptameron, actually appears in print, to my knowledge at least. Now, I've done an entire episode on the Heptameron, so I'm not going to cover it here. If you want to take a look at the Elements of Magic or the Heptameron, take a look at my video on that topic. It's a really wonderful magical classic. All in all, the Quartus is a rather lovely little magical manual, and what's perhaps most striking about it is its flexibility. Unlike so many other manuals, which often feature extreme ritual strictures, the Quartus allows for a range of the ways for one to get the magic done. But if that's a bug or a feature is going to be up to the sorcerers out there, not for me to decide. But it does rather give the lie to sometimes the contemporary grimoire traditionalism idea that medieval and early modern magic conceived itself as having to be done in a super strict one-way approach. Again, the Quartus is like choose your own adventure of magical manuals. So in that way, I find it to be very interesting and very wonderful, perhaps for people coming to magic for the first time. The Quartus, however, would go on to be translated along with some biographical information in an English edition in 1655 by Robert Turner. Yep, Robert Turner is back again. This edition would be combined with Agrippa's book on geomancy, which I'm going to be making a whole future episode about geomancy, and particularly geomancy as described by Agrippa, along with the Heptameron as it first appears in 1559, a fun dialogue about demons by Georg Pictorius, an enthusiastic cheerleader of the early modern witch trials, another textbook on astrological geomancy by the famed 12th century translator Gerard of Cremona, along with a famous manual of planetary magic known as the Arbitel, which also I've done an episode on as well if you want to check it out. But these all appear in one handy-dandy volume, and of course Robert Turner would also be responsible for translating many other books of early modern magic into English, including things like the Ars Notoria, without the noti, and texts like the Archidoxis of Magic, attributed, of course, famously to Paracelsus. So now, yes, the big question. Did Heinricus Cornelius Agrippa write the Liber Quartus? Most scholars hold that he did not write the book. Now, an important objection to this position is that of Dr. Stephen Skinner, one of the most important scholar practitioners of this entire generation. And I will say that if Dr. Skinner says something, we should all listen, and thus I take his consideration very firmly into mind as I say what I'm about to say. Generally speaking, the objections that are raised about the authorship of Agrippa for this text are that Johann Weyer rejected the text as inauthentic. He actually calls it a loose broom that simply sheds straw, which is just, that's great shade. Further, that the text only appears well after Agrippa's death is also taken as a cause for doubt. Regardless, the text certainly knows Agrippa, there's no doubt about that, and definitely wishes to practicalize sections of the text. However, I have to admit, I'm pretty skeptical that Agrippa wrote this personally, and my skepticism takes basically two dimensions. The first is the Latinity and the stylometrics of the book. I've been reading Agrippa in Latin now for weeks, months, teaching this Agrippa seminar, and reading over the Latin of the Quartus, and it just doesn't sound at all like Agrippa. Agrippa's Latinity is full-on humanist, with a flair for dramatic run-on sentences and quasi-classical flourishes. That's just not the Latin of the Quartus at all. Further, Agrippa's style is very distinct in almost all of his writings, from his orations to his letters to his printed books to his unprinted stuff. They're packed with cribbed quotations. Rarely does he speak in the first person, and he has a kind of declamatory distance before plunging into the sublime at times that's incredibly distinct from the hurried, somewhat manic writing of the Quartus. And finally, and I think, frankly, most damning to my mind, is that the magical style of the Quartus is just fundamentally at odds with the Agrippa's agenda of the Magica Reformata, beginning as early as 1510 through the Hermetic intensity of the Italian period, and then the mystical skepticism that flowered in the mid-1520s to finally his mature expression of magic as he thought about it in 1533. The Quartus, to my mind, represents the very modern style of magic that Agrippa, following Ficino, Pico, and Reuchlin, that they all sought to reform at best and deracinate at worst. The Latin just isn't right. The style doesn't fit, and the magic is fundamentally at odds with Agrippa that I've been studying now for weeks and months teaching this seminar. If I were a betting man, which I'm not, this is just not a bet I'd take. So, if not Agrippa, who wrote it? The scholar Thomas Willard has suggested the French Paracelsian Jacques Gorey as possibly the author of the Quartus, along with the Arbitel and maybe the Paracelsian style Archidoxis Magicae. I frankly think that's more plausible than Agrippa being the author, so you're going to have to put me in the skeptical camp here. But that Agrippa didn't write it doesn't make the Quartus any less interesting at all. It's perhaps most fascinating in its ceremonial flexibility as a digest of the great deal of medieval and early modern magical practice, or even frankly as a kind of beginner's guide to spirit conjuration, especially attached as it is to the Heptameron. In that way, it's rather lovely, but certainly short, in my mind, of the lofty Agrippan goals of divine illumination and the blissful regeneration of the human being through communion with God. Paul Summers Young has the most recent and, in my opinion, the best English translation of the text, along with the Heptameron. However, the editions of Donald Tyson remain pretty helpful, especially in his commentaries, and of course, you should consult Dr. Skinner's edition as well. The Quartus is a testimony to the odd half-lives that we might all leave behind. I mean, I wonder how long it'll be until people think I'm writing grimoires or something. But I don't think this one's by Agrippa. But I do think the Quartus is worth a study, regardless. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.